Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're resuming the World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution series. I'm continuing on with the end of video 4, which, as you'll recall, was about whether or not life could come from non-life. I cut video 4 off early last time because after writing enough script for a 35-minute video, he finally started touching on stuff that I actually want to cover, so rather than make an hour-long video of my own, I decided to split that one in two. So let's go!
Macroevolution hasn't happened. So in nature, life comes only from life of its own kind. Dogs don't give birth to cats, and horses don't produce cows. Frogs don't have snakes. Apes don't give rise to humans.
One of these things is not like the others. And nobody thinks that an organism would have to produce offspring of a different kind than itself. It's just little differences that add up over time that start looking like bigger differences. Humans are not all that different from the other great apes. Our bodies have the same general shape, our faces are very similar, especially in juveniles. Hell, I went to the zoo once with a friend who is an evolution-denying creationist, and when we got to the gorillas, he couldn't stop himself from commenting on how much they look and act like humans. My kids used to attend a weekly educational program at that zoo, and their pickup and drop-off spot was very close to the gorilla exhibit, so while waiting for them, we would often sit in the viewing area and eat our lunch while watching the gorillas. The baby and adolescent gorillas behave exactly like human children, playing games with each other, cheating at those games, getting into fights that the mother would have to step in and break up, bothering the mother when she just wanted to be left alone, the older one picking on the younger one being a nuisance to the older one. It was fun, as a tired parent, to watch another species be put through the exact same parental challenges that we face. So, appearance and behaviorally speaking, we are not all that different from the other great apes. In fact, I'd say we're probably closer in morphology and behavior than a wild wolf is to a chihuahua, which is a relationship that creationists have no trouble accepting.
But if evolution is true, then that, in essence, is what had to happen.
No, that did not have to happen. Never would it ever be expected for any living organism to have offspring that more closely resembles a different species of already extant organism than itself. Were that to happen, that would throw a huge wrench into our understanding of evolution.
Simple, lower life sprang into existence, and from that, over eons of time, complex life came about. So according to evolution, life does not come from life of its own kind, but rather from other kinds of life, in contradiction to the evidence, the law of biogenesis.
I don't understand where the issue is here. We have seen significant changes arise spontaneously within populations of organisms, like single-celled algae that develop the stably heritable trait of multicellularity. It's still algae, but now it's multicellular algae, which opens up the door for all sorts of new developments. We've seen bacteria evolve to make use of a new food source. We've seen lizards develop new organs to help with the digestion of a new food source when introduced to a new environment, and that in only 36 years. So we've seen large-scale changes in populations of organisms, but somehow, slightly larger-scale changes over longer periods of time are completely unthinkable.
In the field of philosophy, there's a law known as the law of excluded middle.
Well, color me impressed. He actually named a law that's not one of the laws of thermodynamics, that is actually a law. It's his first time, and it only took, 4.5 hours of video for him to get there?
That law says that every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. So as long as we precisely and clearly define what we're talking about, we can know whether something's true or false.
Correct, but it has to be very, very, very precise, leaving absolutely no wiggle room.
If I say Bill is bald, well, as long as I precisely define what a bald person is, 100 hairs or less or something, then I can know if Bill is or isn't bald.
Well, no, because now I can ask questions like, do body hairs count? Or what about pointy sideburns that are at a weird angle? It's not precise enough to say yes or no for sure. Now, if you define bald as having less than 100 hairs on the crown of your head, now we're getting somewhere.
As long as I precisely define what a human is, and scientists have done so, then everything either is or isn't a human.
So do you care to share with the class what this precise scientific definition of human is?
According to the law of biogenesis, a non-human will not give rise to a human. So again, the evolutionary theory contradicts the findings of science.
Okay, so I guess you're not going to share the definition with us, so let's do that ourselves. Human being is a culture-bearing primate classified in the genus Homo, especially species H. sapiens. Human beings are anatomically similar and related to the great apes, but are distinguished by a more highly developed brain and a resultant capacity for articulate speech and abstract reasoning. In addition, human beings display a marked erectness of body carriage that frees the hands for use as manipulative members. Some of these characteristics, however, are not entirely unique to humans. The gap in cognition, as in anatomy, between humans and the great apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos, is much less than was once thought, as they have been shown to possess a variety of advanced cognitive abilities formerly believed to be restricted to humans. That's from Encyclopedia Britannica, and it looks as though that definition isn't quite precise enough to give absolutely everything a definite yes it is human or no it is not human label. It looks like it would be more of a gradient. But that's Britannica, a great source but not necessarily a definitive scientific source. So let's look at the Biology Online Dictionary. The simple definition is a bipedal primate belonging to the genus Homo, especially Homo sapiens, modern humans. Now, I'm not going to read through this whole page, but it does go into quite a bit more detail than the Britannica page, including a list of known human species, of which there are currently 16 members. So even if this definition of species is enough to apply the law of excluded middle, it still includes guys like Homo habilis, which I'm pretty sure most creationists put in the definitely ape category. And also there's that whole bit about relationship. Human beings are partially defined by their relationship to the other great apes. So if you claim that you are not related to the other great apes, then that means that definitionally speaking, you do not believe that you are human. At least not if we're applying the law of excluded middle here.
And requires that very thing to occur. Evolutionary theory is not in keeping with the scientific evidence on this matter, but the biblical model, once again, is in perfect harmony with the scientific evidence.
You are talking about the law of excluded middle here, right? Are you saying that the Bible defines things to be exclusive better than the theory of evolution? So, the word kind, for instance, is defined so precisely that we can know for certain in any situation whether or not two things are the same kind? Glad to hear it. Now make with the definition.
God created life, created it according to its kind, and told it to reproduce according to its kind. Genesis 1, 11, 20, and 24.
Great! Now tell us what a kind is so that we can use the law of excluded middle to determine which things are the same kinds.
The biblical model doesn't have the problem of having to make the evolutionary jump between various kinds of creatures.
Okay, but you're the one who brought up the law of excluded middle. In order to determine if something has indeed jumped between kinds of creatures, you need to specifically define what a kind is. Otherwise, you're falling into the fallacy of excluded middle, where you present a proposition as if the law of excluded middle applies, but it isn't defined specifically enough to actually result in only two options being available.
God created life according to its kind, and those kinds have remained constant since creation, with only small variations occurring, changes which amount to microevolution, not macroevolution or Darwinian evolution.
Well, I mean, I've already given you examples of pretty big variations. Speciation events have been observed, new structures have been observed, new genetic information has been observed, significant behavioral changes have been observed, and any sort of limiting mechanism that would stop these changes from accumulating past a certain point has never been observed.
The idea that life comes only from life of its own kind leads us into another area of science, which I'll discuss somewhat briefly. Darwin's evolution has itself evolved over the decades, since evolutionists have had to admit time and again that it can't work the way they thought it could.
Or could it possibly be that all fields of science evolve over the decades as our understanding increases? Like, would you say the change of our understanding of physics that resulted from Einstein's contributions was a bad thing? Of course science changes over time. That's a feature, not a bug.
The alleged evolutionary timeline has changed constantly.
Yes, as we learn more about the various aspects of evolution, biology, geology, paleontology, etc., we narrow down on the correct timeline. The change in our understanding of the timeline does not change what the timeline actually was, it's just us getting closer to the reality of the situation.
Dates change as to when various animals supposedly lived.
Sometimes, yes, we do find fossils that are outside the known timeline for that species, and this can cause us to reevaluate the known range for that species. But really, how would you expect it to work? Like, just for a moment, pretend that evolution is true. Now say we find a species in a rock layer that is slightly older than where we thought that species should be. Which would be the better option at this point? To insist that the find is wrong in spite of the evidence, or to adjust our conclusions to match the new data? I mean, as a creationist, I know your whole shtick relies on ignoring data that doesn't fit with your conclusions, so I imagine this is a hard thought experiment for you, but please try.
The order of evolutionary development has changed constantly.
Yeah, we have rearranged phylogenetic trees, and a lot of them still aren't fully settled yet. This is because the most accurate way to construct a phylogeny is with genetic data, and we just don't have genetic data available for any organism that is only known through fossils. So they are stuck using morphology for those phylogenies, and there is no guarantee that any of them are correct, and new data or new methods of interpreting the data can serve to develop new phylogenies that are potentially more accurate. And I know the way I'm describing this sounds like it's just a bunch of guesswork, but it really isn't. It's based on rigorous statistical analysis of thousands of different options for phylogenies and figuring out which ones are the most statistically likely using different methods. If each of these different methods come out with the same tree on top, that means it is very highly likely that that is the correct tree.
New theories as to why various animals develop their various body parts are constantly being revised.
The why this happened this way part of evolution is sometimes the most difficult part of studying it. When looking at one feature on an organism and trying to figure out which selection pressures work to develop that feature, you have to take into consideration the entire ecosystem that this organism lived in, and the ecosystem that its predecessors would have lived in. Ecosystems are very complex places where it is impossible to take every single factor into consideration, so it makes perfect sense that as we learn more about various ecosystems, past and present, our conclusions about features that developed in these ecosystems would change to accommodate our new knowledge. Again, it's a case of us learning more. Are you against learning? It's certainly coming across that way.
In fact, evolution itself didn't originate with Charles Darwin. Forms of evolution have been considered for millennia.
Yep. And this is true to a greater or lesser degree with every scientific discovery. In fact, there is a law known as Stigler's Law of Eponymy, which states that no scientific discovery is named after its discoverer. And while it is not a universally true law, its basis is in the fact that science is a very slow progression in our understanding of the world, with each scientist building on the knowledge acquired by the scientists that came before them. Sometimes with the big breakthroughs, a scientist will become famous, but more often than not, their breakthrough was just one more step in that progression, no bigger or smaller than the last one. It's just more noticeable to the public. And this applies to evolution as well. Darwin did some pretty amazing work on the subject, but he was not the first to propose it. And had he not done so, Alfred Russel Wallace likely would have been the guy that became famous for evolution, as he developed a very similar idea at roughly the same time as Darwin. To quote Mark Twain on the subject, "It takes 1,000 men to invent a telegraph, or a steam engine, or a phonograph, or a photograph, or a telephone, or any other important thing. And the last man gets the credit and we forget the others. He added his little mite. That is all he did." These object lessons should teach us that 99 parts of all things that proceed from the intellect are plagiarisms, pure and simple, and the lesson ought to make us modest.
And for millennia, those ideas have had to be revamped to stay in line with the latest scientific understanding.
Yeah. Our ideas change to match our understanding of how things actually work. We don't pretend that things work in a way that they don't in order to stay in line with our previously held ideas. And this is bad because... why?
Darwin came along at the right time in history for evolutionary theory to become popular, so he's typically credited with coming up with evolution, but it by no means started with him.
Well, you're downplaying his role quite a bit, but you're not entirely wrong, and it doesn't matter. We don't accept evolution because it has Darwin's name attached to it.
A fundamental component of his theory was natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that nature selects those species that are most fit or suited to a particular environment for survival.
So close and yet so far. Natural selection selects individuals from a species that are more fit than other individuals from that same species, with fitness here roughly equating to reproductive success. Having more offspring that survive to reproductive age is more fit. This will then have the effect of shifting the genetics of the population as a whole toward containing more of the alleles that gave those individuals the reproductive advantage. And if a population becomes divided and the divisions are reproductively isolated from each other, there will be slightly different selection pressures on the different populations, so several generations down the road they will be quite different from each other. Extend this out over geologic time, and you get the origin of all the species as evolution by natural selection. Hey, that sounds familiar. I think there might be a book or something with that title.
And those species which aren't as well suited and don't migrate to a different area, they're going to die out.
Again, no. Natural selection, although selecting individuals, is actually acting at the population level. If a population does not divide and become reproductively isolated, then it is likely that any beneficial mutations will work their way through the whole population, keeping the entire population roughly homogenized. It is when a segment of the population moves or is cut off from the main population that divergence happens. It's not about entire species being wiped out because they didn't move. Though that certainly is a possible mechanism for extinction, natural selection does not actually require that organisms without the beneficial mutation be killed. They just have less reproductive success. If you, me, and our spouses are all put on an island together, if I have 3 kids and you have 1 kid, then I had more reproductive success than you. Did me having more kids than you cause you to die? No, but the alleles that I carried and passed on to my kids that you did not have are now more frequent in our little population on this island. That's it. That's all there is to it. Now, it is entirely possible that your death was what resulted in me being more successful. I mean, if you died after 1 kid but I kept going, then that would be a factor, but it is not a necessary factor.
So it's a filtering system. And that's by and large true. The creationist doesn't have a problem with that idea. The problem is that Darwin believed natural selection could be the means by which his evolutionary theory could happen.
It's the mechanism that decides which genes become more frequent in a population. And between 2 reproductively isolated populations, different genes will come out as the winner. That's all there is to it. If you accept that natural selection is a real thing, then you already accept all that is necessary to accept evolution.
The idea that all forms of life came about from previously existing, less complex life, starting with a single cell eons ago. But scientists have realized today that Darwin was wrong about this.
Have they now? Really? Are you going to show any published papers on the subject, or is it just quote mine time again?
Natural selection alone couldn't cause evolution to occur.
No, by itself it cannot, and nobody disputes this. Darwin himself did not know what mechanism carried the variation within a species that led to natural selection being able to favor certain traits over others. But we know now. Reproductive isolation plus mutation plus natural and sexual selection equals evolution.
It might filter, but it can't create.
Right, that's the mutation's job. Well, I mean, not just mutation. There are other sources of genetic change like retroviruses, but no need to get too complicated here.
Evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard said, "The essence of Darwinism lies in a single phrase. Natural selection is the creative force of evolutionary change. No one denies that selection will play a negative role in eliminating the unfit. Darwinian theories require that it create the fit as well."
Yes, Stephen Jay Gould, of course. Before looking this up, I'm going to give my guess. This is him talking about the debate between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Because, inevitably, any time a creationist quotes Gould, that is always what it ends up being. Because Gould will just point out some flaw with gradualism, and then creationists will remove the context of the debate about gradualism and present it as if he's talking about the theory of evolution as a whole. So now to look up the article. Okay, so now that I've read it in context, I was entirely correct. And it looks like what I said in my video on Friday about us eventually discovering that evolution happens gradually in the genetic code without large morphological changes, followed by sudden morphological changes that rely on the previous genetic changes, places me in the punctuated equilibrium camp. And here I thought I was being diplomatic. So that's basically what this essay was about. The phrase hopeful monster, which is the title of the essay, was originally a criticism against punctuated equilibrium. The idea that an entire new species could show up rapidly, fully formed. So in this essay, Gould explains how it appears sudden morphologically, but it relies on a gradual accumulation of genetic change which build the foundation of the sudden change.
And therein lies the problem. Evolutionists recognize that they can't even claim that natural selection could create the fit. Dutch evolutionary botanist Hugo de Vries long ago said, "Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest." So evolutionists have realized that natural selection can't cut it.
Which was said in 1905, before we had a very good understanding of genetics or how they work or what they even are. So it's a good thing then that we now have several mechanisms that do explain the arrival of the fittest.
Enter neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is the idea that natural selection coupled with genetic mutations, DNA accidents, provides the mechanism for evolution to occur. So the idea is that every now and then a beneficial mutation might accidentally happen, and it'll stick around without being selected out of existence because it accidentally makes a species more fit than other species that don't have that mutation.
You know, probably the most frustrating thing about you is that you hit relatively close to the mark at times when describing some of these processes, but then you just get all of the details muddled up at the end. So you're close when you say species because evolution acts at the population level. Natural selection, though, can act both at the population level and on the individual level. Natural selection doesn't cull a species out because a different species develops some beneficial mutation. That is a possibility, but it's just one potential outcome. But if an individual within a species has a beneficial mutation, then that individual will have more reproductive success, and so that individual's genes will, over time, become more common in the population, as its offspring have slightly better reproductive success than the other members of the species without that mutation. You're making it sound like it's some binary thing. This one beneficial mutation develops, everything without the beneficial mutation must die. But that's not how it works. Life is not black and white, it's a gradient. Some individuals will be slightly more fit than others, some will be slightly less fit, some will be a lot more fit than others, and some will be a lot less fit. And everything in between.
But that claim has problems because genetic mutations don't create new raw material or information.
Yep, they do. Duplications happen. Insertions happen. Retroviruses inserting regulatory code happens. We know many mechanisms that create new raw material and information, and the best that creationists can say to refute this is that a copy of already existing information is not itself new information, completely missing the point that now there are two copies of a gene that will accumulate their own individual mutations. They will not mutate in an identical fashion. So now we have a gene that does whatever the gene did before, but since it's redundant, it can mutate new functions without harming the organism by removing the old function.
Which is necessary for the kind of change required by evolutionary theory. Speaking of that issue, British engineer and physicist Alan Hayward said, "Mutations do not appear to bring progressive changes. Genes seem to be built so as to allow changes to occur within certain narrow limits and to prevent those limits from being crossed." To oversimplify a little, mutations very easily produce new varieties within a species and might occasionally produce a new, though similar, species. But despite enormous efforts by experimenters and breeders, mutations seem unable to produce entirely new forms of life.
Yes, Alan Hayward, because when discussing what it is possible for genetic mutations to accomplish in biology, it's important to quote a physicist. And it bears mentioning that Hayward was very much convinced of the fact that the Earth and universe are old, and admitted in his book that the succession found in the fossil record is undeniable, but attributed that instead to several individual creation events with God tweaking and testing the various designs. In the book that you are quoting from, he discusses all of the major creationist arguments for a young Earth, and explains why they do not hold up. But yeah, he said mutations have limitations on them, so you quote that and ignore the rest.
Have you ever made a copy of a PDF on your computer or downloaded a copy of a PDF and opened it and found that errors had happened in the copying process?
No, because computers are better at checking for errors than our genetic material is.
Those errors are like mutations in genetics. Maybe individual words were messed up. A few letters of a word were changed to other letters, termed codon errors in genetics. Maybe duplications could occur, which is the idea that words, sentences, even entire paragraphs could be duplicated in the book somewhere. Translocation could occur, which is the idea that chunks from one part of the book could just be moved from one area of the book and inserted into another area. Deletion could occur, which is the idea that chunks of the book could just be lost. These kinds of errors or mutations can occur, and there are others, but notice no new material is written when these errors or mutations occur.
Wow, you are so close. But this is kind of a bad analogy, and as much as I have often said that a computer programming language is not a proper analogy for DNA, it is a better analogy than the one that you're using here, and I have given a demonstration of this before, so here's past Rhino to explain it.
So here's a Python script, just 7 lines of code. It simply draws 10 circles in a row overlapping. Now, through a duplication mutation, the entire code is copied out again, which results in 20 overlapping circles. And if there's a point mutation that changes this FD to an RT, we get 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10. If we then get another point mutation that changes this number from a 10 to a 20, now we have 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10, with the first 10 circles being twice the size of the last 10. But I cheated, I hear the creationists say. I started with a whole genome duplication. That's not fair. Well, it is fair because whole genome duplications really are a thing, but let's do this all again in a different order to see what happens. We'll start by changing this 1 to a 2, and then we get 10 half-size circles. Now we change this FD to an RT, and we get the half-size circles curving downward. Time for a whole genome duplication event, and now we have twice as many half-size circle curving around almost as if inside a bigger circle. Now let's take one step further and change this 0 to a 4, and we get this spirograph-looking circle filled with smaller circles. So that's some simple mutations of the kind that happen all the time in nature that result in changes that do not glitch everything out. It changes how the program works without breaking the program. Sure, there are more ways to change the code that would end up with it breaking the program, but in our little analogy the code is copied almost perfectly every time, and the ones that change for the better are copied more times than the ones that stay the same or are changed for the worse. And of course, better or worse in living things is mostly a function of their environment, so something that might seem like it's a change for the worse could actually be beneficial. So depending on our code's environment, the pretty spirograph circle of circles might be detrimental when compared to the line of large circles with the curved small circles, or vice versa. And should these codes become genetically isolated somehow, remember the actual lines of code are the genes in this little analogy, it could be that the first variant is favored in whatever environment it finds itself in, and the second variant is favored in a different environment. Continue the changes after the split, and you will get 2 very different looking programs. Add sexual reproduction into the mix and it gets even more varied and complicated.
Thanks, past Rhino.
A new sentence hasn't been written into the PDF.
No, but a duplicated sentence has been written into the PDF, and small changes to existing material can have a profound impact on that material. For instance, if you say, "We invited the strippers, JFK, and Stalin," then have a deletion mutation remove 1 comma, you now have, "We invited the strippers, JFK, and Stalin," which has a completely different meaning with just that one little change. And that's just a 1-character change. And also that's why you should always use the Oxford comma.
Codon errors, duplications, translocations, and deletions. These are mutations, but mutations don't add new information. They simply change something that already exists.
Yes, mutations change things that already exist. Now, insertions do straight up insert new genetic material into the DNA, but let's just ignore that and focus on the duplications for now. They duplicate something that already exists, and then other mutations change this thing that already exists. If you do not understand how creating 2 copies of something and then making changes to only one of those copies can result in something completely new, then you should have your PhD in mechanical engineering revoked. Like, Take a beginner's course in any sort of 3D design program, AutoCAD, Tinkercad, Cinema 4D, whatever, choose whichever one you like. In most of them, they give you a few basic options for shapes that you can add. Using nothing but these few basic shapes, with the ability to combine them, duplicate them, and subtract from them, you can make some pretty complex 3D models. Hell, learn how to use Adobe Illustrator sometime. You can make some pretty intricate graphics using nothing but basic shapes and duplication with modification.
Evolutionists Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan came out and strongly expressed their disagreement with the idea that genetic mutations could be the mechanism for evolution, as neo-Darwinism contends. They said, mutation accumulation does not lead to new species or even to new organs or new tissues.
Yes, they did say that. In their introduction of the book where they propose the mechanism by which they think that new genes are developed. Now, I haven't read the whole book, but from reading further into the intro, it looks like their hypothesis is that the source of evolutionary novelty is from the acquisition of entire genomes from other organisms, mainly through the process of symbiogenesis. So that quote is along the same lines as the creationist favorite from Darwin on the Eye. Creationists will take a spot from the introduction that appears to support the creationist position, and ignore, in this case, the entire book that comes after it. Okay, so that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Lucas Hefner, who says, "We know how both morality and motion work. To call a flavor good is to compare it to a good or bad thing. To call an object moving is to compare it to a moving or stationary thing. That being said, I'm confused why some say to have relative morality there must be a perfect moral entity, while no one has ever said to have relative motion there must be a perfectly moving entity." Good point. The religious will often say that our morality is an indication that there is an entity out there with perfect morality, which ours is based on. Therefore, there must be a God. But morality is not absolute. It is dependent on the situation, and you can usually get religious people to agree on that in some cases. Same thing with motion. To the best of our knowledge, there is no perfectly stationary entity out there that we base all of our measurements of motion on. We choose a reference point to measure against depending on the situation. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the strings that keep the puppet that is my channel moving and looking like it's alive. If you'd like to be my puppet master, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!